Hi, this is Mr. Mike from the Mechanicsburg Learning Center with Mr. Mike's episode 71 of Mr. Mike's Dino-A-Day. Thanks so much for tuning in. And I'm going to talk about an animal today that most people have never heard of, including myself, until very, very recently. I think it's very exciting to talk about new animals because it's always fun to learn something, even when we're not in school. So today the animal is called LEDUMAHADi. LEDUMAHADi. LEDUMAHADi was discovered in the 1980s in what was once, well, it is now, it's Southern Africa now, but back then it wasn't Southern Africa. It was just a piece of the giant hunk of landmass that we called Pangaea. So LEDUMAHADi is a South African word that means a giant thunderclap. So LEDUMAHADi, when you hear the thunder at night, or especially in the morning, that's what it was actually named after. Think of this, a dinosaur called LEDUMAHADi. It was about 30 feet long, lived about 199 to maybe 190 million years ago. At the hips, it was 13 feet tall, so we're not talking a small thing. It was big, but 30 feet isn't huge, but it was nonetheless related to the sauropods. It was actually an early sauropod, the long neck guys. But it wasn't the big ones. But here's what's interesting about LEDUMAHADi. It was the largest land animal that the world had ever seen at the time it lived. So up until that point in history, there was no other land mammal or land lizard or anything that walked on land that was bigger than LEDUMAHADi. So since that time, of course, the sauropods grew to gigantic sizes, Argentinosaurus and all the titanosaurs. But at the time it lived, it was the largest land animal that the world had ever seen. Now, what made this? Let me give you, some examples of other sauropods, and I want you to just look at them, and then we'll talk about them. This is Camarasaurus. Has sort of a squatty face. Take a look at its legs and long tail. Here is your classic Brachiosaurus. Long neck. For an animal this size, it actually has kind of slender legs, okay? Take a look at Apatosaurus / Brontosaurus. Bigger back legs, long tail, tiny head, and then finally another version of the Apatosaurus. Extremely long tail, very thick neck, and take a look at the legs. Now, the thing that made LEDUMAHADi unique is its forelimbs. The legs in the front were extremely wide and bulky. It was almost hard for them to imagine an animal that of only 30 feet but had such big legs. And the other thing about it is, if you look at the this Apatosaurus leg here, see how it's bent just a little bit here. Well, this made LEDUMAHADi kind of unique also in the fact that its legs were very big, but they could flex also, so they bent. In fact, they think the thing could crouch down. Now, 30-foot animal, again, not the biggest thing in the world, but at the time it was, but an animal that big to be able to crouch down is actually kind of interesting, because when you have a gigantic animal, especially the sauropods, they have to have very strong limbs to hold them upright, because to put all the weight on a bone that would bend would really put a lot of pressure on the thing. So LEDUMAHADi was unique in the fact that it was a pretty big animal, the biggest for its time, and up to that point, the biggest that the world had ever seen, the biggest in history. But it could somehow flex these legs. So that's what made it unique. Discovered in the 1980s by Professor James Kitching, and they just found some big bones. They did not identify them, so they took them someplace. They had them in storage, and then a woman named Cynthia Kemp said something to Adam Yates at a museum and said, these are gigantic bones, we should take a look at these. Well, Yates went out and found some more, and still it had no name. 2012, we have a new person at the same museum. His name is Professor Jonah Chorier. He and his assistant Blair McPhee went out in 2012 because they had these bones. They said, let's go back to where these were discovered, and sure enough, they found more. And then in 2018, they actually named it. And the name means giant thunderclap. Its second name, its species name, is mafube. So it is LEDUMAHADI mafube. So it means, the mafube part means dawn. So the full name means a giant thunderclap at dawn. So there you have it. We believe the animal was, we've only found one specimen so far. So as we find more, we'll know more about what the animal looked like. But we liken it to a typical sauropod, but only about 30 feet long. We know that the animal was about 14 years old when it died because we have been able to cut the bone, which I mentioned about yesterday, and measure and look at the growth rings. So it was in the neighborhood of about 14 years old when the animal died and ended up becoming a fossil. It is known as a sauropodomorph, so it's not a full-fledged sauropod. It actually dates before the gigantic sauropods, and morph means to change. So because it had those interesting looking legs, scientists kind of look at it as an evolutionary experiment. Like, did this actually work? And if it did, it would continue to have lineage and ancestors, or maybe it just kind of turned out to be a scientific dead end. So this lived in the early Jurassic. As I mentioned, about 199 to 190 million years ago. It was quadrupedal, and maybe it could, with those strong legs in the front, maybe it could rear up a little bit, but it mostly stayed quadrupedal, which means it moved around on four legs. So let's give you another look at, a similar animal, the Apatosaurus/Brontosaurus, and think of the animal that we have called LEDUMAHADI whenever you hear thunder striking. Here's the story. LEDUMAHADI mafube, which means giant thunderclap at dawn. Go back 200 million years and you could take a glance of large LEDUMAHADI with some luck or happenstance. It doesn't qualify as most gigantic to exist, but still it's most impressive to a seasoned scientist. Because up until that time, no other dinosaur came close to matching its substantial size and bulk so grandiose. The sauropods have since eclipsed LEDUMAHADI's size, but keep in mind it took some time for them to maximize. LEDUMAHADI's height was 13 feet up to its hip. Preferring plants, it used its mouth to grip and rip and snip. The length was 30 feet, and we believe it weighed 4 tons, but given these statistics, we don't think it went for runs. Its forelimbs told the story of just how it moved around. Unlike the sauropods, they're more imposing pound for pound. It traveled on these bulky legs. They flexed so it could crouch. I cannot say decisively if it would ever slouch. LEDUMAHADI's genus name is vivid and poetic. It means a giant thunderclap. That's wonderfully aesthetic. The species name mafube adds the perfect complement. Depict a giant thunderclap at dawn was their intent. And so we should recall LEDUMAHADI with respect whenever dino sizes is a topic or subject. This dino was the largest that the land had ever known. So much can be attained when we examine ancient bone. The LEDUMAHADI, a very ancient sauropod, predating all the big boys, but at the time it lived, it was the biggest thing that the world had ever seen. This is Mr. Mike for the Mechanicsburg Learning Center. We do this every day, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, live on Facebook. We post all of our videos to YouTube. Just look for Mr. Mike Sgrignoli. I thank you for tuning in live, and thank you for sharing. Thank you for subscribing on YouTube and liking these videos. We will do it again, live, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, remember, LEDUMAHADI at dawn.